Welcome, everyone. This is our last class in our series about the book of Numbers. Can't believe we got here so quickly. So we're going to do the last two portions of the book of Numbers tonight. And that is, they're called in Hebrew, Matot and Masei. Matot means, here it means tribes. These are the tribes of Israel. And Masei means traveling, journeys. Okay, so we're going to start with Matot. And what I wanted to do is, this is the only portion in the Torah that has the concept of the tribes in the title of the portion. So I want to look at the importance of tribes in the history of Israel. Because what's happening here in the book of Numbers is the book of Deuteronomy, which follows these two portions. Then there's a new book of Deuteronomy. The whole book of Deuteronomy takes place in 37 days. Even though you wouldn't necessarily know that, there's a lot of written in the book of Deuteronomy, but according to tradition, we know the day that Moses began speaking the words of Deuteronomy, and we know when he finished. So it was only 37 days. So these last two portions of the book of Numbers, here we're completing the 40 years in the desert. The whole story of Israel going down to Egypt and becoming slaves and then being redeemed and receiving the Torah and the 40 years of wandering in the desert. And these two portions are coming to an end. They're coming to an end. And here Moses addresses directly the heads of the tribes. That's how the portion begins. So I want to use this to try to understand the place of the tribes in Jewish history. So the first most basic thing is that there are 12 tribes, and these 12 tribes come from the 12 sons of Jacob. In other words, it's a story of how a family became a nation. Jacob had 12 sons. Each one of them had children and more children. And by the time we came out of Egypt, so each one of the tribes had many tens of thousands of people in their tribe. Now, spiritually, we're told, and this is not going to be our subject here, but that the 12 tribes of Israel, they correspond to the 12 months of the year and the 12 constellations in the sky. And so the number 12 is not just any old number, that the 12 tribes represent something much greater than they are. And so their energy is represented in the 12 months of the year, and in astrology and in astronomy. So all of the ancients looked to the constellations as a way to try to understand the universe, especially understand time and even space, because in a circle, each of the astrological signs take up 30 degrees. So a whole circle is 360 degrees. And when divided by 12 is 30 degrees each part of the circle. So the 12 tribes, like I say, represent a microcosm of how we look at time and space. So as I said, the whole story, especially in the book of Exodus, is how a family becomes a nation. And the point I want to make is that the tribal structure was very, very, very important to everything about Israel. We talk about Israel as being one nation, but throughout our history, there's a very, very strong component of the tribal structure. Now, one way we can see this is an important tradition that when we crossed the Red Sea, when we were running away from the Egyptians, and a great miracle occurred, and the sea split, and Israel was able to cross over to the other side. And then in the morning, when the Egyptians were chasing us, the waters closed back, and they were all drowned, and Israel was saved. But the Midrash says that the sea did not open into one path, it opened into 12 different paths, one from each tribe. Now this has a symbolic meaning to it. In other words, even though the nation of Israel is one nation, again, going back to when we were a family, each of the children had its own destiny, its own energy. And so here we have what's called unity and plurality. In other words, we have one nation, but it's made up of 12 distinct energies. So this we saw for those who were at the classes in the beginning when we looked at the first portion, the portion of Numbers, where it told how each tribe was counted separately and how they camped in the desert around the tabernacle. There were 3 tribes on each of the 4 sides. But in the Torah, each tribe is counted separately. And each tribe had a banner, a flag, which, like in modern times, countries have a flag of the country. But here, each of the tribes had their own flag. It wasn't that there was one flag for all of Israel, there were 12 flags. And in the book of Numbers, it says that each person camped by their family and by their tribe and by their banner. So in other words, the tribal structure was very, very strong. In the next portion that we're going to do today, Masei, it talks about when Israel would come into the land, how would they divide up the land? How is it determined who settled where? Again, we see that each tribe was given an inheritance, and everyone in that tribe settled in that geographical place. So here, it wasn't like you come into Israel and it's like, okay, everyone, go find a good place. Find your favorite place in Israel and build a house, and that's what it will be. No, it was divided by the tribes. And in this portion, again, there's only so much we can get to. There's an explanation of a war that was fought against those. If you remember, in our last class, we talked about how the king of Moab, Balak, hired the magician Bilam to curse the Jews. And remember, in the end, Bilam couldn't curse the Jews, but he devised a way to try to get them to sin, and then they would bring punishment upon themselves. Hopefully, many of you were here last week when we learned about this. So in this week's portion, there is a war between Israel and these same forces that were trying to keep us out of the land and were trying to curse us. And in it, it says, how do we know who went to the army? So it says, Elef lemate, 1,000 from each tribe, 1,000 from each tribe. So here also we see it wasn't that we just had the army was formed, whoever wanted to join, joined, and they divided into units and battalions, and you have an army. No, it was based on the tribal structure. 1,000 for a tribe, 1,000 for a tribe. So having said this, I don't know how much you know about American history. I know very little about Chinese history. I'm sorry to say, I would like to know more, but perhaps you know that when the United States was originally formed, before it was the United States, so most of the people who sailed across the ocean from Ireland, Scotland, England, France, Germany, all the different countries in Europe, most of them were running away from religious persecution. Most of them were from smaller Christian groups that felt oppressed in Europe. And so they came to America, and by and large, each one settled in a different part of what we now call the United States. And so before there was a revolution against the British, there were 13 colonies. 13 colonies. Each one had its own legislature. Each one had its own money. Each one had its own flag. Each one was mostly from the same type of religion. And when they were fighting the British, so little by little, they realized that each state can't fight the British by themselves. We need to create what's called a federal system. And you can hear it in the name, the United States. Each of the 13 colonies agreed to join together for a greater good. And yet, to this day, 250 years later, each state still has its own flag, has its own state flower, has its own Supreme Court, has its own court system, has its own tax system. But on top of that, there are the United States, is the federal system. And still to this day, there is much disagreement between what is the right of individual states and what is the right of the federal government. To this day, there's still much disagreement about different issues. So the reason I went through American history is because it's very, very similar to Israel history. And in fact, I'm not sure if you know that the original founding fathers that made the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, they were very, very influenced by the Bible. They were very influenced by what we'll call Judeo-Christian ethics. There was even serious thought of making Hebrew the national language. Believe it or not, there was actually serious thought of making Hebrew the national language. Some of the best known colleges in the world, Harvard, Yale, in their emblem, they still have Hebrew written in it. The emblem of these famous colleges have Hebrew in it. And the whole idea of in God we trust, and all of this is very, very influenced by the Bible. So they also saw the states, in a sense, like different tribes. So taking all of this, like, how do we understand this today? How does the idea that there were 12 tribes in Israel? Israel does not have 12 states. It's not set up like that. But because Israel is what's called the ingathering of the exiles, Israel is one of the most complex societies in the world, because there are people from over 120 countries who have settled in Israel. And each one came with their influence. And of course, there are non-Jews who live in Israel, but there are Jews from 120 countries who came back to Israel. And you have religious, and you have non-religious, and you have Ashkenazim, and you have Sephardim, and you have Hasidim, and you have Haredim. And actually, you see every color of skin in Israel, of Jews coming back from places all over the world: black, brown, yellow, white, and everything in between. And this is like the gathering of the tribes. This is like a gathering of the tribes. Now, in the Western world, I simply do not know enough about Chinese history or culture. But when you look at the Western world, the great emphasis is on the individual rights, that every person should have the freedom of expression and religion, the pursuit of happiness. Now, all of this is wonderful, but what we see in the Western world, because of this tremendous emphasis on individualism, the idea of a country being tribal is not something that most people understand. As I said, people love their country and maybe are proud of their country, but it's very, very different than a tribal structure to a society. I hope you can understand what I'm saying, because in a tribal society, the bigger picture, in a sense, sets the tone for the individual within that. And in most Western countries now, you don't see that kind of cohesiveness. You don't see that kind of national sense of destiny. You might have pride in one's soccer team, in one's, what is it called, that famous contest of singing, and everyone's rooting for their their singer or their group or their basketball team or their soccer team or their football team. But you don't see a sense of national destiny in most cases. And a tribal structure is, you do see that. And so again, I can only comment about in Israel. I grew up in the United States, and I actually go and visit every year. And it's just a different energy within society as to what is the purpose of life, what's purpose of the country, what is the bigger picture. So that's how I relate in Israel, that Israel still has, even though we don't have individual tribes like we once did, and we don't have individual inheritances in the land where everyone from one tribe will live in the same part of the country. But still in consciousness, there's still a great tribal consciousness, a great tribal consciousness. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're still in Parshat Matot. A war is fought, and in the Bible it says that Pinchas, he was sent to lead the army. And so there's a question, why was it Pinchas? So if you remember, again, for those who were here last week, we learned all about Pinchas. Pinchas was the one who, when even Moses didn't know what to do about a certain situation that was happening, that Pinchas went to Moses and reminded him of what the Jewish law is in that case. And if you remember, there was a whole plague spreading in the camp. Thousands of people were dying. And because Pinchas, he did what he did, he stopped the plague. And if you remember, God rewarded him with a covenant of peace. So you would think, well, maybe Pinchas should retire now. Why is he the one to lead the army into battle? And so we learn a very interesting thing from this, that there's an idea that a mitzvah is a commandment. So, and we have 613 commandments in the Torah. So who is recorded as having done a mitzvah? Let's say it's in the Bible and they're discussing a certain mitzvah, and they're attributing to someone who did this mitzvah. So what they do is, the one who finishes the mitzvah is the one who gets it recorded in their name. So one might think, well, why isn't it the one who starts the mitzvah? That's the person who thought of doing this, and this is the one who got the whole thing happening. Why is it after the one who finishes? So this, as everything in the Torah, this can teach us a lot. And I'm sure everyone is going to understand what I'm talking about. How many times do we start something and don't finish it? How many times do we want to accomplish something, big or small? It could be something very small. It could be something that takes days, weeks, months, or years to accomplish. But how many times do we start with great enthusiasm and either we don't finish or we finish without the enthusiasm that we started with? And so there's two different statements in the Talmud. One says everything goes after the beginning, and the other one says everything goes after the end. Now, what does this mean? First of all, it's not a contradiction. It sounds like, well, one says everything goes after the beginning, the other says everything goes after the end, so they can't both be right. But that's not how we learn. They can both be right. There's certain circumstances where the importance is to start something. Other times it's like, if you don't finish it, what have you accomplished? So there's beginnings and there's endings. And obviously the ideal situation is that we finish what we begin. And that actually brings us back to the very beginning of the Parshat of Matot, where Moses addresses the heads of the tribes and tells them the laws of taking vows. A vow is a promise. A person, in a sense, officially makes a promise. I am going to do X, or I am not going to do X. Well, in Jewish law, that takes on a commitment to actually doing it. And the principle is, if you say you're going to do something, you need to do it. And if you're not going to do it, do not make a vow or promise to do it. So here, in other words, if you begin by making a vow or a promise, you have to finish it. And if you can't finish it, you have to go before 3 judges, or here it says it does not even judges. It could even be the princes of the tribes. And in certain cases, it could just be 3 regular people, and they have to release you from this vow because you said you're going to do something. You can't just not do it. You just can't. But if you can't, then you have to get permission to withdraw your vow. So here, Pinchas, so why is he sent to fight the war? Is because, in a sense, he began the mitzvah. He began, in a sense, fighting back against these people that wanted to destroy us. And so now, who's going to finish the story? It's got to be Pinchas. So this is a great lesson to all of us, that we should be very, very careful of making vows, of making promises to ourselves, to other people, and to God. We should be very, very careful. And if we do, we should be very careful about finishing what we start. So beginnings are important and endings are important, but the ideal is that they should be together. That we should finish what we begin, and ideally with the same enthusiasm as when we started. Okay, so that's Parshat Matot. Now we're going to go to the last portion of the book of Numbers, which is Masei. Masei, I already mentioned that part of the portion is there's a description of the land, of the borders of the land, and there's a description of how is the land divided up. But it begins with a very, very interesting idea, is, again, the context. This is the last portion of the 40 years in the desert. And so the Torah reviews 42 stops or encampments that we made in the desert. This is like a mini history. Moses was reviewing for the people what happened during these 40 years. Where were we? Where did we go? When did we go there? And so the first part is a review of the 40 years in the desert. And the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov is the founder of the Hasidic movement. And he said that just like everything else in the Torah is archetypal, meaning everything that's written in the Torah is not about one-time events that happened a long time ago. Because you could ask, why do we need to know the 42 places where they were? Now it's 2022. What good does it do me to know where they were and the names of the places, and they went from here and they went to there, went from here, they went to there? So the Baal Shem Tov explains that everything in the Torah is an energy that reappears in every person. So he explains that these 42 journeys applies to everyone. Because when the soul comes down into this world, and then at some point the soul leaves this world, well, the time in between is like the 40 years in the desert. The 40 years in the desert represents each person's wanderings in this world. And so the names of the places here are not just historical. They're also spiritual, psychological, and symbolic of different stops along the way. So that is important to say, that we're in a sense, when we're reading these different journeys, if we really understood them, then we would understand we're reading our own personal history. So I'm going to read in English a verse right at the beginning of the portion that says that it begins like this: "These are the journeys of the children of Israel who went forth from the land of Egypt according to their legions under the hand of Moses and Aaron." Okay, now this is the verse I want to get to. Moses wrote their goings forth according to their journeys at the command of God, and these were their journeys according to their going forth. Now, if you didn't pay a lot of attention, you wouldn't catch a very subtle difference in this that's going on in this verse. I'm going to read it again. I'll give you a hint already that the order of the beginning of the verse, and if anyone's following this, it's the 33rd chapter, the second verse of the book of Numbers, the 33rd chapter, the second verse. Now try to listen carefully. Moses wrote their goings forth according to their journeys at the bidding of Hashem, and these were their journeys according to their goings forth. So if you notice, there's an inverse going on here. In the beginning, it says he wrote their journeys according to their going forth. But at the end of the verse, he says he wrote their going forth according to their journeys. Exactly the opposite. So usually we won't even notice such a thing. But there's something very, very profound happening in this verse. And that is a certain energy or dynamic is being explained here about a person's journey in this world. So we're going to say a number of things. So first of all, and I think we all know this also, sometimes when we go from place to place, it could be we move. It could be we change a job and we go from this job to that job. It could be in a relationship. We have this relationship and then we leave it and we go to another relationship. The question is, when we go and we come, what's the primary reason? Am I leaving my job because I hate it and I just can't stand it anymore and I need to do something else? Or is the reason I'm leaving this job because I found a much better job? Am I leaving because I need to go? Or am I leaving because I need to come? I hope everyone could follow that. In other words, what's the motivation? What's the reason that we make changes? Am I afraid of something, so I'm running away? Or because of great plans that I've made, I'm going towards something which is going to lead to a great advance in my life. Am I leaving a relationship because it's just not working? Or am I leaving on good terms, but I now realize there's something better for me? So that is very subtle in this change of context. The beginning of the verse, again, it says they're going forth according to their journeys. And the second part is their journeys according to their going forth. But let's take it a little bit deeper, because we have this dynamic being explained here. And this dynamic in Hebrew is called ratzo v'shov, running and returning. Running and returning. Again, this is in the context of the 42 journeys in the desert. Each one of them, they left one place and they came and they camped in another. And then they left that place and they camped in another. So this dynamic is called running and returning. And we're told that this dynamic exists on every level of reality. These 42 journeys are manifest on many different levels. For example, if you just put your finger to your pulse is running and returning. If you put your hand on your heart is running and returning, running and returning. Every breath that we take is this dynamic of running and returning. You go to the ocean on the new moon, and then you return on a full moon. Well, the waters are in completely different places because the tides are running and returning. And we now know also in every atom, there is a pulsation, like in electricity. And we know that even the way our brains work are these synapses, the electrical currents between synapses in our brain. So I know I just said a lot, but this idea is hinted to here in these journeys, that all of life is a flow of running and returning, of going and coming, of going up the ladder and coming down the ladder, having ups and having downs. And so the way, again, we would have to do it in Hebrew, but the way these 42 journeys are written, it's emphasizing this kind of dynamic that the soul is experiencing. And in fact, every level of existence, from the physical to the spiritual, has this kind of dynamic, run and return dynamic. Now I mentioned already that these 42 journeys applies to every person, and that the whole story of the 5 books of Moses can be seen as the story of an individual soul coming down into the world. That's like going down into Egypt. The word Egypt in Hebrew, Mitzrayim, comes from the root Meitzar, or Tsar, which means narrow, a narrow place. That's what Egypt actually means in Hebrew, a narrow place. So when a soul, a spiritual soul, comes down into a physical body, it's like going into a narrow place, because our souls are infinite in potential. The body is very limited, very finite. So the whole story of Israel going down to Egypt and becoming slaves is the story of the soul coming down into the body and the needs of the body, in a sense, enslaving the soul to fulfill its purpose. So the question that every person can ask themselves, am I a body that has a soul, or am I a soul that happens to be in a body? But if we look at that, I'm a body that has a soul, then in a sense, the soul is in a state of slavery to the body. And then we are redeemed from Egypt. We receive the Torah. And then we are heading for the promised land. But it's not so simple. We end up wandering for 40 years. But that's the story of every person. And after 40 years, and in our tradition, the Torah is our guide. The Torah is our guide how to become free from the slavery to the needs of the body. Not to put the body down, not to ignore the body, and not to look at the body as being something evil. It's not. But who's running the show? Who's running the show? Is it the body or is it the soul? Ultimately, they have to make peace, because they're both important. The soul without a body can't exist in this world. And a body without a soul cannot exist. So this is a bigger picture, especially as we're ending the book of Numbers. And this portion is reviewing with us what is the journey of life like. So here I'm trying to bring a bigger picture of what is really being taught here. Okay, so one other subject in this last portion Give me a second here. Is the concept what's called a city of refuge. A city of refuge is described a number of times in the Torah. And what it is like this. If someone, God forbid, would murder someone else, then the Torah prescribes the death penalty. It should be clear, though, that it was hardly ever carried out in actuality. That would be a different subject. But if someone murders on purpose and they are caught, they are punished. But what happens if someone kills someone else accidentally? An accident. It's an accident. The person did not mean to hurt this other person, but it happened. So there was what's called a city of refuge, where this person would have to go to. And they would stay there for a certain amount of time, and eventually they could leave. Why? Is because even though they didn't do it on purpose, things don't just happen. And there's some level of responsibility for what happened here. So they would have to go to a city of refuge. So again, we have the question. Today, we don't have cities of refuge. So what do we learn from this? What can we learn? First of all, we should know that the whole idea in courts around the world about different degrees of what's called murder or killing or manslaughter are based on these teachings in the Torah, where there are different levels of responsibility and there's different levels of punishment, whether it's on purpose or not on purpose. But a person who kills without meaning to has to go to the city of refuge. So what do we learn from it today? So one of the many things that we can learn from it is the idea of a mental city of refuge, a psychological or intellectual city of refuge. Why? Because each person does things that they regret. Everyone does things that if they could do it again, they would do it differently. Everyone makes mistakes, big and small. So what do you do? What do you do when you've done something wrong? How do you fix it? So in our tradition, you do what's called tshuva. You do three things. You express regret, you confess, you admit what you've done wrong, you show regret, and you commit not to doing it again. That is the process of tshuva, and everyone can do tshuva. But let's get back to the city of refuge. So even if we don't do things wrong, we all have energies that kind of chase us, our past. Everyone has a past, and there are things in it that it's hard to get away from. So everyone needs a spiritual city of refuge, where they can feel safe. Where they can feel safe and not be chased by the past and not be chased by our mistakes and our wrongdoings, where we can enter into a place where we can do tshuva, where we can change, where we can come to inner peace within ourselves and inner peace with God. Now, this is just a basic idea about this city of refuge, but it's really taken one more step where what's been developed is using this image of a city of refuge as a meditative place, a place to enter into meditation, contemplation, prayer, that everyone needs a place where they can feel safe to talk to God and to be honest, and has a safe place, a quiet place, a peaceful place where they can meditate and they can be prayerful and they can find inner peace. So that's a very good place to start, to finish our series on the book of Numbers. I'll end with a blessing to everyone that we all can find this city of refuge where we can relate to our inner soul, we can relate to God, we can come to understand our journey in life, and we can make the best of our lives.